Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our weekly tropical weather outlook video. Today is Saturday, February 22nd, 2025. It is the last discussion, I think, of the month of February, and we are now less than 100 days away from hurricane season. That's what today's video is going to be all about. The fact that we're now less than 100 days away from hurricane season. Yesterday was the 100-day mark. We're going to go over now, since we're getting closer to hurricane season, what to expect, things to look out for over the next several months, including current ENSO conditions and what to expect with ENSO going in the future, which includes looking at climate models, not just for ENSO, but also for potentially how conditions might shape up for this year's hurricane season. All things we're going to talk about today, and also things that we're going to begin to talk about a lot more over the next several weeks now that we're starting to enter spring and inch our way once again very closely to hurricane season, because we are now, as I said, less than 100 days away, 99 days to be exact, very close. I guess it counts as less than 100 days since we're one below, but once again, the 100-day mark was yesterday, and at least till June 1st, which is the start of the Atlantic hurricane season, we are 99 days away. And if you want the number for the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, which begins on May 15th, probably subtract 16, so that would roughly be around 83 days until the East Pacific hurricane season begins. All right, so first order of business for today, as always, every single week, as we typically look at sea surface temperature anomalies across the Atlantic and Pacific. And this is something we've been watching since December. And you can even go back to my videos from December and see the progression of how sea surface temperature anomalies have shaped up. But this map is one of the few maps that we will be looking at a lot throughout the next several weeks, especially when it comes to the Atlantic. One of the few things we'll be monitoring is how warm is the Atlantic, especially as we get towards April and May. We can even take a look at how warm the Atlantic is right now, in which, in fact, it is pretty warm, especially throughout the Caribbean and Gulf, especially in the Gulf. Very, very warm. Some of these anomalies as much as 2, even 3 degrees Celsius above normal, meaning lots of very warm water in place. And obviously, if this were hurricane season, or at least if this were March or April, you'll be looking at this and thinking maybe this is a positive, or that's at least one positive for hurricane season, is if the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies are warm, which in fact they are right now, but it's still February. And once again, we're just getting into the 100-day range before hurricane season. But that's one factor we'll be looking at very closely. How warm is the Atlantic? And right now, that is warm. So positive. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, we have our dying La Nina, and I say dying because I'll show you in just a little bit. La Nina is definitely not going to stick around for much longer. But the question will be, does La Nina go away? Which it looks like it is right now, because we still have some of these sea surface temperature anomalies that are colder along the central and western Pacific. But definitely as we get towards the Eastern Pacific, you're starting to see a lot more of these much warmer sea surface temperature anomalies begin to show up and fill in. The question will be just how much of these cold anomalies remain. Do they remain at all? And maybe, in fact, do we see a return of La Nina, meaning the equatorial Pacific cools back down further or remains as cold as it is right now? Or do more of these warm anomalies fill in, especially further along the equatorial Pacific, and we head towards an El Nino? That's also going to be very important, because as well, that impacts the hurricane season, because the warmer it is out here, the more rising air we're going to get in the Pacific, meaning wind shear in turn, and more sinking air in the atmosphere in the Atlantic, and that is obviously not favorable for hurricane season. Meanwhile, on the other hand, if it is colder in general, like it is now, especially in the Central Pacific, that would mean less rising air, because the ocean water is not warm, so you don't have a lot of moisture to rise up into the atmosphere and create thunderstorms. And that would mean more potential for rising air and favorable conditions in the Atlantic, which is why ENSO is very important. And another way I kind of like to look at how the atmosphere is responding, at least with ENSO, is the SOI index, because this measures pressure patterns in the Pacific, which directly has to do with warming and cooling of the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. And right now, we are in a positive SOI, at least the average of the last 30 days. The SOI is positive 9. And usually, as a rule of thumb, when we have a positive SOI, especially a strongly positive SOI like we have right now, that's generally favorable and indicative of a La Nina. And obviously, negative is the opposite. But we have a strong SOI in place right now. The 30-day average is positive 9, and the 90-day average is positive 7. So above the 7 threshold, which usually is especially indicative of La Nina in place. So La Nina is definitely there. But notice over the last several weeks, especially since mid-month, we've been on a downtrend slightly with the SOI. And if we even take a look at some of the latest daily SOI values over the last several days, they've been pretty negative. And we'll have to watch over the next several weeks. Do we get more of these, weaker pressure patterns in the Pacific, which would lead to a weaker SOI, and that would probably lead to warming of the Pacific? And that would help with El Nino, or do we keep the La Nina pattern? And you can even see it as well as the SOI kind of has weakened a little bit over the last several weeks. These are the Nino 3.4 sea surface temperature anomalies. So basically this map, but kind of turned into a graph of exact measurements or exact values. And right now in the Nino 3.4, the latest value is negative 0.3 Celsius. And that is actually just below the La Nina threshold. La Nina is at negative 0.5. The latest daily value, because this map updates daily, is at negative 0.3. So at least on the daily values, we're definitely on the weaker side. In fact, even at cool neutral right now. So that definitely indicates that we're exiting La Nina. And if we were to take this map and kind of average it out over a weekly basis, which is what the CPC does, the Climate Prediction Center does every single week, they have these ENSO kind of outlooks and updates in this really nice long PDF map. But they have weekly estimates of each ENSO region, specifically, though the one that we look at is the Nino 3.4. And what do you know? That too averages out at least over the last week. This is updated though as of this past Tuesday. Is that right? Let's see. Yeah, updated as of this past Tuesday. So we're probably going to get a new value next week. But at least the latest weekly value that the Climate Prediction Center gave, what do you know? It matches up with negative 0.3 that we have on the latest weekly chart. By NOAA Coral Reef Watch, or at least this graph, which gives us an exact value on a daily basis. And another way to also look at ENSO is not just at the surface, but also below the surface as well, because this kind of gives us an idea of maybe the sea surface temperature anomalies that have not reached the surface yet. And this also has to do with indicating whether or not we're in a La Nina, or maybe we're in a La Nina, but we are slowly going exiting La Nina, and potentially, or at least the potential may be there for El Nino. This graph is a really good way to visualize what is below the surface in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies. And you could see right now, over the last several weeks, definitely indicative that we are in some sort of La Nina because of all of these cold sea surface temperature anomalies in the Pacific subsurface. But notice, especially as the frames go on, because these frames, I think, are roughly updated every 5 days. Notice, especially since December into January and then into this month, notice how we begin to lose a lot of this deep cold that is sitting below the surface in the Pacific. And a lot of that is beginning to make its way to the surface and eventually kind of disintegrate as well. And then meanwhile, you could see in the far right corner, and this is towards the Eastern Pacific, you notice as well, more of these warmer anomalies beginning to pop up. And as well, a lot of these warmer anomalies beginning to pop up too further towards the west, and this is in the Western Pacific. And part of El Nino development is when we're able to get westerly winds along the surface of the Pacific Ocean, and that helps transport these warmer waters that are in the Western Pacific east, and eventually those make their way to the surface and become an El Nino. Some of the climate models indicate that that's what's going to happen over the next several months, but we'll see, and I'll show you the climate models in just a moment. But at least with trade winds, though, over the last several weeks, and this is actually the velocity potential map, but this also too is good to keep in mind in terms of what to watch for with ENSO, because at least when it comes to velocity potential, this is an indicative of rising or sinking air in the atmosphere. And as I said before, rising air tends to correlate more with warmer sea surface temperature anomalies. And you can see right now, at least over the next several days in the Pacific, you can see a bunch of these oranges and yellows, and that represents sinking air in the Pacific. So you would assume that we're probably not going to get much in the way of warming. And this is at least indicative when we have a lot of this sinking air, at least in the Pacific, that usually is indicative of a La Nina pattern in place. So definitely weakening slowly in terms of the La Nina if we were to take a summary of all the graphs that I showed so far. But the atmospheric pattern, at least the atmospheric response for La Nina, is still there. And as I also mentioned before, over the last several days, we had a lot of negative SOI values, and you could see we definitely didn't have as much of this sinking air that at least is being forecasted for the next few days in the Pacific. We definitely don't have much of it right now, which makes sense as to why we have a bunch of negative daily SOI values. But it looks like we're going to see sinking air return, probably going to see stronger trade winds as a result. And at least over the next several weeks, if I were to make an inference based on this graph, La Nina, or at least colder neutral in the shorter term, at least over the next several weeks from now till, where does this graph go? Roughly to early to mid-March, we'll probably see La Nina remain for the meanwhile. But beyond that, what are we looking for? What is the ENSO looking like beyond that? And one good way to look at that is with this graph, and this is also by the NOAA Climate Prediction Center, and this is ENSO probabilities by season. So this is a 3-month average period, and this extends all the way out to September, October, November. That's what these 3 letters indicate. They indicate pretty much the first letter of each month. And as we are right now in late winter, we obviously have a La Nina in place right now. But notice over the next several months, you see La Nina probability dramatically drops off, and we start to see these gray bars increase in chances as well, meaning neutral will take over, and this roughly happens once we get towards mid to late spring and into the early summer. And then you'll also notice towards the end here, you kind of start to see some of these reds begin to show up, and that's indicative of El Nino. But also interesting at the same time, you start to see as well this blue the blue at least associated with La Nina, that also goes back up a little bit as well. So maybe a little bit of uncertainty on whether or not we'll see an El Nino or a La Nina. But at least though, if you want to look at probabilities right now for hurricane season, the one that you want to pay attention to the most is this graph right here, this bar right here, and that is for August, September, October, which if you know hurricane season tracking by now, those are the 3 peak months of the hurricane season: August, September, October, which obviously we have the exact climatological peak in early September. But August, September, October are the 3 peak months of the hurricane season. And what is the ENSO probability for that? Neutral. So we don't have a significant chance of an El Nino in place, at least when you look at this graph, although we'll see what it shows when it updates next month for March. But this is significant because if we don't have an El Nino for this hurricane season, that obviously would mean one less inhibiting factor for hurricane season to be active. So that is important. And then there's also by the Climate Prediction Center, there's also this other graph too, and this is kind of a average of a bunch of models, climate models, I think, from all over the world. And this too, if you look at the next several months, the general trend that they show, slight warming up, but not necessarily really so much warming that we get above the 0 degree line and get into warmer ENSO territory or even El Nino. In fact, only one model shows that at all, and they actually have a pretty significant El Nino, but really nothing significant. And you can even see here this red line, this is the dynamical average, so I assume this is probably the average of most of the models. And that generally, you notice the pattern, we see a warming, but it kind of bottoms out, especially once we get towards the summer. It kind of flatlines, and we don't see so much in terms of significant fluctuation in the ENSO. And then obviously by the time we get to August, September, October, notice where we are, at least with the majority of these models, and especially the averages. We have the statistical and the dynamical average. Notice where we are by August, September, October. Generally on the cooler side, not overwhelmingly in El Nino, and not very, very strong into La Nina, although some models do kind of indicate we're going to stay in La Nina, although that's only a few models. The general average, once again, kind of remains more towards neutral. And neutral is actually not bad for hurricane season at either. We usually think of, El Nino being bad and then La Nina being good for hurricane season. Neutral years sometimes also tend to be interesting for hurricane season as well. So we'll have to see. But these are averages. At least these two graphs are averages of all of the models or a bunch of climate models. How about specific climate models? At least ones that I look at, and we'll definitely be looking at as well over the next several weeks as they roll out for March and April, and as we get towards hurricane season. I have three main models, and I'm going to end off the video with this. Three main climate models that I look at, the CFS, CANCIPS, and the NMME. Let's start off, though, with the CFS, and at least in sea surface temperature anomalies. And this is, again, for the August, September, October time period, and I decided to do a world view so we could see how the Atlantic looks and also how the Pacific looks in terms of determining whether or not we have an El Nino or a La Nina. And what do you notice? What are some of the main things that stick out? First off, in the Pacific, notice we have these warmer anomalies. So I guess the CFS is showing a little bit more of a aggressive signal for El Nino. So there's that. That's obviously not that much of a positive factor. That's not a very positive factor for Atlantic hurricane season. And then meanwhile, in the Atlantic, what do they have? Definitely a warm Atlantic in place, even through the deep tropics here, although kind of on the cooler side, and especially a lot of the warmth in the subtropics. And as a result, we look at the sea surface temperature anomaly plot. We can also take a look at, with a grain of salt, but some people like to do this. We can also look at the precip anomalies across the Atlantic, because I guess that would generally indicate whether or not we have rising motion and a lot of moisture in place, which would obviously mean is the atmosphere primed for tropical activity. And as you can see, for August, September, October on the CFS, they have a warmer ENSO, a warmer Pacific, and as a result, you would probably look at this map and you would think, maybe this hurricane season would generally be average, but definitely nothing eye-popping, especially with a lot of these, drier anomalies near Africa. So this generally looks like an average season. It doesn't look too eye-popping, but that's the CFS. What is the other model? The CANCIPS. This is another one that I like to use. And what do they have in their sort of graph? What do they have as their model output? They too also have generally some anomalies in the Pacific that are warmer, but compare that to what the CFS shows, definitely a lot colder of a look, especially in the northern Pacific and in the tropical eastern Pacific as well, and definitely a lot more of a warmer look in the Atlantic too, especially near the Canary Current as well. And if you are also familiar with tracking hurricane season, When you have a very warm look, especially right around the Azores and the Canary Current, and that kind of extends into the deep tropics, that's a classic look for an active hurricane season. So we have that. And as a result, what is the precip look for the peak season of the hurricane season in the Atlantic? Definitely a lot more active, especially in the deep tropics and in the Caribbean. The Cansips obviously has a much colder Pacific, definitely a warmer Atlantic, and as a result, we get a lot more precipitation in the Atlantic, and this would definitely be indicative of an active hurricane season. And then finally, the NMME model. This is actually kind of a model ensemble, so it takes multiple models, all from North America, and puts them into an average. And very interestingly enough, the NMME, um, in fact, doesn't really have that much warmth in the Pacific at all. In fact, they actually kind of have a colder tongue, almost as if they want cool neutral, maybe even La Nina, to maybe hold on for a little bit, at least through this year. And then obviously they have a pretty decently warm look in the Atlantic. And as a result, generally, an active-ish look. I would generally say this is an active look in the Atlantic, at least for the peak. A little dry through the Caribbean, although I wouldn't put too much stock into that because, this is not, some people actually like to use these precip pattern maps even this far out. It's February. They some people like to use them to kind of indicate, is there any potential tracks in the models? What is the potential pattern in terms of what we could be looking at in the Atlantic? And I would say that that's not entirely, blasphemous, that we can't do that at all. I guess there might be something there to it, but at least in terms of it being February, I really wouldn't put too much stock into, does this mean the Caribbean will be dead or not? That's something more or less that we look at once we get closer to the season. But overall, still not as bad of a look for the Atlantic, especially when you compare that to the CFS, which looks a lot more lackluster. So definitely a little bit of disagreement in the models, as to be expected, because we're just getting into the 100-day mark. We just got below 100 days. But these next few weeks are going to be crucial to look at, especially when it comes to whether or not, in terms of looking at factors on what will be shaping up, what are the puzzle pieces that'll be coming into place for this hurricane season. And obviously, that'll have a huge impact on whether or not this year will be active. All things, though, we'll be watching over the next several weeks. And as I do on this channel, every Saturday, so as I posted this video today on Saturday, I do these tropical weather outlooks every Saturday. So if you're interested in them, and if you also like what you saw today, since we're, wrapping it up now, would really, really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, especially subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can get whenever I upload these videos every Saturday. And if you want to share this with anybody that you think might find any interest in this, I would also appreciate it as well. And yeah, we have 100 days. We're now less than 100 days away till the hurricane season. It might not seem like a lot of, might seem like a long shot right now, but trust me, especially once we get into March and we get past March, time really flies by, and before you know it, we'll be in hurricane season. With that being said, stay safe. Thanks for watching. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will talk again very soon.